Hello, I'm Emma Wanzel with the Center for Ethics Education, and this is the Ethics in Society podcast. Today I have Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan, who is the Endowed Chair in Ethics and Director of Center for Applied Ethics at University of Wisconsin-Stout. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So kind of the first thing that we're going to get into is just a little bit about your general background. So how did you first get involved in ethics?
Yeah, it's a long path, it seems. I was a philosophy major in undergrad and then moved on to grad school where I thought I was going to be doing more feminist film theory, and things changed and I ended up getting a master's in information science and then on to a PhD where I became really interested in the intersections of what were then, back in the late 90s, emerging online spaces, how researchers were interacting in those spaces, and then the piece that I've continued with is how IRBs review research that again at that time was taking place in online focus groups and online ethnographies, even things as simple as online surveys, which are now very normal and we see them all the time. But back then they raised some new ethical challenges.
Okay, awesome. So you talked about this emerging field of kind of the internet and kind of this need for kind of ethical analysis, right? So I'm just wondering, you talked about how kind of maybe the technology is going ahead of the ethics. So this is kind of like an off-script question for you, but how do you think we can pair those two together more as they go forward? Or do you think one is ever lagging behind the other?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think there's always that kind of cycle of, new technologies, law and ethics struggle to keep up, then norms take place and take hold, and it's this kind of ongoing cycle of things. I think, though, with ethics and methods, I always come back to how do our ethics and our research methods align, and are there ways that we're doing new forms of research or ways that we're doing research that's really challenging traditional principles of research ethics and forcing us to think about new ways and what are new ethical frameworks for us to do our work in and perspectives around research ethics. So I think that would be how I'd come at it. We would always want to be thinking about that cycle of regulation, law, ethics and technologies, and how they intersect, and it's very fluid. It's always a fluid continuum, and so I think as researchers, it's our responsibility to keep up with all of those things, as hard as that may be, to keep up with how we're responding both from a regulatory perspective, but also from an ethical perspective.
Awesome. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, how things like online surveys were changing, how research was being done. So now, how is emerging technology changing the way that research is conducted in a day-to-day basis?
Right. Yeah, it's such a challenge to keep up with some of these things. So the way I've characterized in some of my recent work is I've looked at kind of three different phases of internet research, and we're almost moving into the fourth phase, I would say, at this point. But from the early days, again back in the 90s, we were doing very simple kinds of analyses of listservs and spaces that were mostly text-based, and then moving into more graphical user interfaces. Then we moved into the social media phase, and the creation of data just exploded. And then from there into the big data phase. And now we're really at this point where we're talking so much more about artificial intelligence. We're talking about bots. We're talking about deep fakes. These things that we didn't have to think about back in the late 90s. We were worried about is a person going to take an online survey twice? Can we confirm their IP address? And you think how more sophisticated things have become now when we are dealing with really really challenging ways of confirming research data, validating research data, confirming the reliability. We're really in a different a different place than we were, 20 some years ago, and so it's hard for IRBs. I think that's where I've been tracking my research over the years is, how are IRBs keeping up and how are IRBs responding? And oftentimes, we and I'm on an IRB myself, so how do we keep up and how do we know how to ask the right questions? And so over the years we've recommendations have been for put a data scientist on your IRB, put a data security person on your IRB, put a community-based participatory researcher on your IRB. So it's been ways of trying to inform from within, listen to your researchers, find out what kinds of methods they're doing, find out what kinds of emerging research they're doing, because there's so many new forms like sentient technologies and sensory. We're putting out so much more data than researchers even need. So we've really moved from kind of a hypothesis generating to a hypothesis where we have data, so we can create hypotheses as opposed to the other way around. We used to be much more, hypothesis driven as opposed to generating. So I think there's some interesting ways to think about the ways in which research itself is changing, and the paradigm of research is so affected by big data and artificial intelligence, and that's everything from medicine to social behavioral research.
Awesome. Yeah, it's almost like the scientific model has been like flipped,
yes.
Which has some very interesting implications. So you do a lot of work with IRBs, and you kind of touched on that. I'm just curious, like, what's like a common maybe mistake or like something that you wished that IRBs that you see like in your field did better?
Yes, it's normal.
No.
Yeah, and just to say, and I don't really have a field because I think internet, social media. I mean, it permeates every field. Every field is using it, embraces it, and so forth. But particularly for IRBs, I think that what can we do better? I think we've this has been a complaint for a long time, for years and years, that we've only focused or come from the biomedical perspective, that we have principles that don't fit. And we've seen this, whether it's in, again, internet research or community-based participatory research, we've said this model doesn't quite fit. So what could we do better? We could ensure that we're thinking about the regulations and the ethics in purposeful ways, and in terms of ethics as what's possible and ethics as what's good science. And so for me, it's if you have bad science, you have bad ethics, and vice versa. And so I think for IRBs, there's criticism always levied saying, oh well, IRBs shouldn't look at methodologies, but that's part of the ethics, and that's part of the science to look at how valid are these methods. So I think we just want to keep improving, thinking about understanding new ways. We're at a really critical time in science and technology where, it's unprecedented with growth and so forth. And so I think we want to not be afraid. We want to really avoid those overly paternalistic models and learn from research and learn from, our mistakes and other researchers' mistakes, and move the enterprise forward in a really positive way.
Awesome. So from what it sounds like, and with your response to about IRBs and in terms of your own career, it seems like you really focus on having like an integrated approach. So we're going to try and bring as much together as we can. What would you say to researchers or maybe even undergrads who are like just starting out? So you're the director of the Center for Applied Ethics, and a lot of times I think ethics gets divorced from the applied part, and you're really working on integrating that. What advice do you have for students or young people who are really looking to make ethics like not just a supplement, but like actually make it a part of everything that they're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really important. So the work I do at UW-Stout is about infusing ethics across campus curriculum and community. So it's everything from teaching, first year students, and we use the language of the Hastings Center from years and years ago, how to stimulate your moral imagination. Like, what does it mean to think in terms of ethics? What does it mean to understand ethical frameworks and to embrace other perspectives? We talk about, how do you define conflict and ethical issues? How do you define moral dilemmas? And then what are steps that we can take to resolve some of our ethical issues in civil ways, in ways that we don't just degenerate into fighting and arguing and screaming at the other side. So I think we try to learn how to disagree respectfully. I think that's a big part of applied ethics, learning how to talk across disciplines, and that's really what I do. It's Stout is I work from computer science to social science. Depending on the day, I'm in a very different disciplinary space. So for me, it's learning the context and learning the language of those disciplines, and then bringing ethics in, and again using those principles from the Hastings Center and working through ethics as process, and ensuring that our students are equipped to everything from recognize an ethical challenge to be able to describe it and define it, and to recognize their own biases in those challenges. We all have biases, we talk a lot about implicit bias and really, making sure people understand. It's, we all have biases. It's not a fatal flaw. It's addressing them and then moving into the decision-making piece of ethics. And people are people get nervous. Students get kind of afraid to take a stand. And that's something that I think is really important in life, to learn how to recognize your ethical issue, define it, and then take a stand on it.
Awesome. So there we going to end with some wise words from Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much.